The dog planted his paws into the wet concrete and refused to move. Rain slid off his black fur in thin silver lines, pooling beneath him like he was part of the street itself. The officer tugged the leash once, then again, his voice tight with embarrassment and fatigue. But the dog didn't even flick an ear. His eyes were locked on the little girl standing barefoot near the curb, her pink jacket soaked dark, her hands clenched around nothing at all. Sirens bled into the air somewhere behind them, distant and sharp, but the dog only breathed, slow, heavy breaths that fogged the cold night, and leaned closer to her. The girl didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared back at him, as if the world had narrowed to the space between her small shaking body and the animal refusing orders meant to pull him away. People watched from under umbrellas. Phones hovered half-raised. No one understood why a trained police dog bred for obedience was breaking protocol in the middle of an active scene. Not the officers. Not the crowd. Not even the girl herself. But something ancient and unspoken had already passed between them. Something that didn't care about commands or rules. Something that felt like memory waking up in flesh. Under the cold wash of streetlights, the rain had turned the road into a mirror, reflecting blue and red flashes that pulsed like a wounded heartbeat. The police dog halted without warning, muscles locking, leash snapping tight in his handler's grip. The sudden stop drew a sharp breath from the officer, irritation rising before confusion replaced it. This was not how the night was supposed to unfold. Calls had been answered, protocols followed, movements rehearsed into muscle memory. And yet here they were frozen, because the dog would not take another step. Across the street stood a little girl, barely noticeable at first, as if the darkness had tried to hide her. She was barefoot, toes curled against the cold asphalt, her pink jacket soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. Rain plastered her hair to her face, but she did not brush it away. She did not cry. She only stared at the dog, eyes wide and unblinking, like she was afraid that if she looked away, something important would disappear. The handler tugged the leash again, firmer now, aware of eyes turning toward them. The dog did not growl or resist violently. He simply stayed. His paws spread against the concrete, claws scraping softly, anchoring him in place. His ears were forward, his posture alert but calm, and his gaze never left the child. Water dripped from his muzzle in steady lines, each drop marking time that no longer seemed to move. Sirens wailed somewhere behind them, distant but insistent. Radios crackled with clipped voices. The city carried on around the stillness, unaware that something fragile was forming in the open air. The girl shifted her weight slightly, hands clenched at her chest, her shoulders tight with exhaustion rather than fear. She looked too tired to run, too worn down to scream. Whatever had brought her here had already taken more than it should have. The dog lowered his head slowly, not in submission, but in recognition. A quiet breath left his chest, warm against the cold rain, and the girl took a half-step closer before stopping herself. The handler felt a strange pressure behind his ribs, an instinctive sense that pulling again would be wrong. He loosened his grip by inches, just enough for the leash to fall slack. The dog moved then carefully, closing the distance without haste. He stopped within reach, waiting. The girl's hand hovered in the air, trembling before settling into the thick fur at his neck. Her fingers curled tightly as if she were afraid he might vanish. The first sound she made was small and broken, a sob caught halfway between breath and voice. The dog pressed his shoulder gently into her, solid and steady, absorbing the weight she no longer carried alone. Around them, movement slowed. A paramedic paused with a folded blanket in her hands. A woman lowered her phone. Even the rain softened, thinning into a mist that seemed to listen. The handler crouched nearby, boots soaking through, his voice quiet as he asked her name, asked if she was hurt, asked where she had come from. The questions drifted unanswered into the night. The girl rested her forehead against the dog's neck, breathing unevenly, her body slowly relaxing into his warmth. She traced the edge of his collar with reverent care, her thumb brushing over the engraved name. Her breath hit sharply, recognition flickering across her face like a sudden pain. She pressed her palm flat against the tag, then against his fur again, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's his name," the handler said gently, following her gaze. She nodded, eyes filling, and whispered something into the dog that no one else could hear. He responded with a low, emotional sound, tail thumping once against the wet ground. The handler felt his throat tighten as memories surfaced uninvited. A man from years ago, proud and quiet, adjusting this same collar while talking about his daughter like she was the center of his universe. "He walked me," the girl said at last, her voice fragile but certain. Before. The word carried everything she could not yet say. The dog leaned into her as if he understood. The handler looked around at the watching crowd and realized this was no interruption, no breach of protocol. This was something unfinished finding its way back. When they finally moved, it was slowly. The patrol car door opened, light spilling out softly. The girl hesitated, then climbed inside only after the handler promised the dog would come too. He jumped in beside her without command, settling at her feet. She curled inward, hand resting on his back, and fell asleep before the car reached the corner. As the vehicle disappeared into the quiet streets, the handler stood alone in the rain, understanding at last that some bonds do not break when they are forced apart. They wait, patient and unyielding, until the world brings them home. The building they took her to was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, like the city had lowered its voice out of respect. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting pale reflections on clean tile floors that still smelled faintly of disinfectant. The girl sat on a plastic chair that was too big for her, feet dangling, wrapped in a thermal blanket that scratched her skin. She held herself small, shoulders rounded inward, eyes fixed on the dog lying at her feet. He had positioned himself close enough that she could feel his warmth through the blanket, close enough that she never had to wonder if he was still there. Every time someone new entered the room, her body stiffened. Her fingers tightened in the fabric, breath catching just slightly, but the dog never moved. His head stayed low, chin resting on his paws, eyes open and steady. He watched everything without alarm, absorbing the tension so she didn't have to. The handler noticed how her breathing changed when the dog shifted, how her shoulders eased when his tail brushed lightly against her ankle. It was not affection alone. It was familiarity. Something rooted deeper than memory. Questions came slowly, carefully shaped to avoid breaking her open. A woman with kind eyes knelt in front of her and spoke in a gentle voice, asking where she had been staying, who she lived with now, how long she had been alone before the rain found her. The girl answered in short phrases, her voice barely above a whisper. She spoke without drama, without tears, as if she had learned long ago that emotion only made things harder. The dog lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, ears tilting forward, listening with the same seriousness as the adult. When they asked about her father, the room seemed to tighten. The girl's gaze dropped to the floor, following an invisible crack in the tile. She explained what would happen next in careful sentences, pausing often, making space for fear to surface if it needed to. The girl listened without interrupting, eyes steady, her hand resting on the dog's back like punctuation at the end of every thought. When the woman mentioned that they might need to take the dog away for a while, the girl's fingers curled sharply into fur. Her shoulders tensed, breath catching in her throat. The dog felt it instantly, lifting his head, pressing closer, his body forming a quiet barrier. The handler stepped forward before panic could take root, his voice low and certain. He said nothing permanent would happen without time, without thought, without care. He did not make promises he could not keep, but he did not lie either. The girl nodded slowly, trusting the tone more than the words. They gave her clean socks and shoes that were a little too big. She slid them on carefully, as if stepping into a future that didn't quite fit yet. The dog watched the entire process with focused attention, ears flicking at every sound. When she stood, testing her balance, he rose with her, ready. The handler noticed how natural it looked, the way their movements aligned, like a dance they had practiced long ago and never forgotten. Later, when they walked her down the hallway toward a waiting car, she hesitated at the threshold. The memory of doors closing felt heavy. She looked down at the dog, searching his face. He met her gaze calmly, tail giving a small, reassuring sweep. She nodded once, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. The handler followed behind, aware that he was witnessing something delicate being carried forward rather than dragged. Outside, the air smelled clean after the rain, the city rinsed of last night's tension. Birds called from somewhere unseen, ordinary sounds returning to their rightful place. The girl climbed into the car, blanket folded neatly in her lap this time, and the dog jumped in after her, settling at her feet. She leaned back, eyes on the passing buildings, her hand resting lightly against his side. It was not happiness yet. It was not healing. But it was something steady enough to stand on. As the car pulled away, the handler watched until it disappeared from view. He felt the weight of responsibility settle into him, heavier than any leash or badge. This chapter was not finished. It was simply turning the page, carrying with it the quiet understanding that some connections are not meant to be explained away. They are meant to be protected patiently, until the world learns how to make room for them. The dog had been trained to forget. That was the unspoken truth behind every reassignment, every new handler, every command drilled deep into muscle and bone. Forget the old voice. Forget the old routines. Forget the hand that once clipped the leash with affection instead of authority. For years he had done exactly that on the surface. He obeyed, he tracked, he protected. But some memories do not live in the mind. They live lower, deeper, in places discipline cannot reach. The handler noticed it most during quiet hours. When the work was done and the kennel lights dimmed, the dog did not sleep the way the others did. He lay awake, head resting on his paws, eyes following shadows that moved across the walls. Sometimes he lifted his head at nothing at all, ears tilting toward a sound. Only he seemed to hear, ta. Other times his tail thumped once against the floor for no reason anyone could explain. The handler used to think it was restlessness. Now he knew better. It was waiting. Memory surfaced in fragments, the smell of rain on pavement, the weight of a smaller hand tangled in fur. The sound of laughter carried on evening air. These were not images he could name, but his body reacted to them anyway. When children passed on the street, his pace slowed. When a girl's voice rose in fear somewhere nearby, his chest tightened before his handler even heard it. He had learned control, but he had never learned indifference. Across town, the girl carried her own version of forgetting. She did not speak about that night unless asked, and even then, she kept her words short. Adults interpreted this as resilience. They praised her calm, her composure, the way she did not act out the way they expected grief to. They did not see the way she woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, hands searching for warmth that was no longer there. They did not see how she flinched when footsteps approached too quickly, how she memorized exits in every room. But she remembered the dog. She remembered the exact weight of his body against her legs, the sound of his breathing, the way the world had gone quiet when he refused to leave. She drew him in the margins of notebooks, not as a police dog, but as he had been to her, steady, close, unmistakably hers. When she felt overwhelmed, she pressed her palm flat against her chest and imagined fur beneath it, grounding herself in a memory that had not abandoned her. The handler became a bridge without meaning to. He carried updates in careful tones, fought quiet battles in offices where rules mattered more than stories. He spoke about attachment and trauma, and the rare clarity of recognition, choosing his words like tools instead of weapons. Some listened, some didn't. Systems were not built for exceptions, but exceptions had a way of insisting. The dog sensed the shift before it happened. His posture changed, alertness sharpening into something brighter, more hopeful. He watched the handler with renewed focus, reading the smallest changes in breath and movement. When they drove instead of walked, when the route changed, when the city thinned into quieter streets, his body leaned forward, anticipation threading through him like electricity. When the car stopped, the air smelled different. Grass, soap, something familiar layered beneath something new. The dog stepped out slowly, scanning, ears forward, heart pounding with a recognition that bypassed logic. The door opened and there she was. She had grown, not much, but enough that the change landed heavy. Her hair was shorter now, her face thinner, eyes still carrying too much for her age. She froze when she saw him, the moment stretching thin as glass. Then she dropped to her knees without thinking, arms wrapping around his neck with a force that knocked the breath from both of them. He pressed into her, tail sweeping the air, a sound breaking free from his chest that was all relief and certainty. She laughed and cried at once, burying her face in his fur, breathing him in like oxygen. The handler turned away, giving them space, knowing this was not his moment to hold. "You came back," she whispered, voice trembling. He stayed, not because someone ordered it, not because paperwork allowed it. He stayed because some bonds do not require permission. He lay at her feet while she talked about school, waited by the door when she slept, followed her from room to room with quiet devotion. She learned to breathe again with him nearby, learned that safety could be consistent, not temporary. This chapter was not about rescue. It was about remembering who you were before the world taught you to let go. And in the quiet rhythm of shared days, both the child and the dog grew into something stronger than loss. a future shaped not by what had been taken, but by what had returned. Life did not transform all at once. It never does. It changed in small, almost invisible ways, the kind that only reveal themselves when you look back and realize how far you've come. The dog learned the rhythms of the house first, the creak of the floorboard outside her room, the sound of the kettle in the morning, the particular quiet that meant she was awake but not ready to face the day. He learned where to lie, so his presence was felt but never heavy, where to wait so she always knew she could find him. He learned again how to belong. The girl learned how to take up space. At first it was tentative, like testing ice with the toe of a boot. She spoke softly, moved carefully, as if the world might punish her for existing too loud. But the dog followed her without judgment, without impatience, and something in that constancy began to loosen the tight knot she carried inside. She started leaving her door open at night. She started humming while she brushed her teeth. She started asking questions again. Sometimes the memories came back hard and fast. A siren in the distance would make her freeze, breath trapped halfway in. Rain tapping against the windows would pull her back to that street, that night when everything could have gone wrong. When it happened, the dog was always there before anyone else noticed. He pressed close, grounding her, reminding her where she was now. He did not erase the past. He made it survivable. The handler visited when he could, never unannounced, never overstaying. He watched from a careful distance, pride and something like humility settling into him as he saw what had grown from that moment of stillness on the street. The dog was different now, still disciplined, still sharp, but softer around the edges, as if he had finally been allowed to carry all of himself instead of only the parts required by the job. The handler understood then that letting go had never been a failure. It had been an act of trust. There were hard conversations, meetings that stretched long into the evening, people who worried about attachments and risks and what would happen if things went wrong again. But there were also facts no one could argue with. The girl slept through the night now. She ate. She laughed. She healed in small, measurable ways. And the dog, once restless in the quiet hours, rested deeply, his waiting finally answered. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the living room floor, the girl sat cross-legged with a book open in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was watching the dog sleep, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. She reached out and rested her hand on his back, feeling the warmth there, the certainty of it. For a moment, she closed her eyes. "I remember him," she said softly, not to anyone in particular. The dog's ear twitched, but he didn't wake. "I remember my dad," she continued. "But when I'm with you, it doesn't hurt as much." The words were simple. They were everything. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding inside an ordinary house. There were no sirens, no crowds, no lights reflecting off wet pavement. Just a child, a dog, and a bond that had survived loss, distance, and time itself. This was not the end of the story. But it was the place where grief loosened its grip, where love proved it could endure without demanding anything in return. And in that steady, unremarkable quiet, both of them learned the same truth. Some reunions don't just bring you back to what you lost. They show you what was waiting for you all along. Time settled into a rhythm gentle enough to be trusted. Days followed one another without the sharp edges the girl had grown used to, and slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the house filled with sound. Not noise, sound. The soft thud of the dog's tail against the wall when she came home. The scrape of a chair as she pulled it out to sit with him on the kitchen floor. The quiet conversations she had with him in the evenings, voice low, confessional, as if he were the only one who truly understood the shape of what she carried. She began walking him every afternoon, the leash loose in her hand, more symbolic than necessary. He stayed close anyway, matching her pace step for step. Neighbors noticed them, first with curiosity, then with something warmer. People waved. Some stopped to talk. The girl listened more than she spoke, but she no longer hid behind silence. With the dog beside her, the world felt less threatening, more predictable. A retired canine handler mentioned it to someone. A social worker told a colleague. People began to understand that what had happened was not a malfunction or disobedience. It was recognition. The dog had known something before anyone else did. The handler attended the final review meeting alone. He sat under buzzing fluorescent lights while officials spoke in careful language about procedures and exceptions. When it was his turn, he didn't argue. He didn't defend. He told the truth. He told the truth. He spoke about loyalty that could not be trained, about instinct refined by love, about a moment when letting go was the only right command left. The decision came quietly. Permanent placement. No conditions. No future reassignment. The handler felt the weight leave his chest all at once. Outside, he stood for a long moment with his hands on his knees, breathing through the ache that came with endings done right. That night, the girl cooked dinner with help. She didn't need but accepted anyway. She dropped food. She laughed at herself. The dog waited patiently, eyes hopeful, dignity intact. When she placed the bowl down, she whispered, "Home," like a promise renewed. Later, curled together on the couch, rain finally tapping against the windows, the girl rested her head against his side. The street no longer haunted. The dog no longer searched for orders. They had crossed something invisible together. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, something settled forever. Years did not rush them. They arrived softly, layering themselves over ordinary days until memory and present became inseparable. The dog grew gray around the muzzle. His steps slowed, measured now by comfort instead of urgency. The girl grew taller. Her voice deepened. Her laughter came easier. She learned how to drive, how to argue kindly, how to leave the house without looking over her shoulder. They adapted to each other without discussion. Walks became shorter but more meaningful. She learned which patches of sunlight he preferred, which stairs tired him, when to sit beside him instead of asking him to follow. He learned the sound of her keys, the rhythm of her moods, the difference between her silence and her sadness. On his harder days, she spoke to him about her plans. College brochures, dreams that once felt illegal to imagine. He listened the way he always had, eyes steady, presence unwavering. When she cried, it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from gratitude, from the unbearable weight of knowing something precious would not last forever. The handler visited one last time. He knelt slowly now, joints stiff, heart full. The dog recognized him instantly, tail thumping weakly but proudly. The girl watched them together, understanding that love could exist in layers without conflict. When the handler stood to leave, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved each other," he said simply. The final night came quietly. No alarms, no urgency, just shallow breaths and the slow ticking of a clock. The girl lay on the floor beside him, her head resting where it always had. She told him everything she hadn't yet said, that she was brave now, that she would be okay, that she would remember. When morning light filtered through the curtains, he was already gone. They buried him beneath a tree that caught the sun in the afternoons. She visits when she can, sometimes alone, sometimes with people who know the story, and people who don't. She doesn't explain unless asked. Years later, when rain hits pavement just right, she still pauses. She still listens. And sometimes, in the stillness, she feels him beside her again. Not pulling, not protecting, just walking with her. Some bonds don't end, they change shape. And some heroes never leave the ground they chose to stay on.